The single most difficult challenge in the assessment process, I think, has been getting over faculty's suspicion about the process. And it comes reasonably and justifiably from a couple of places. One, it does seem to have been imposed from without, right? From our accrediting bodies to the administration, right? And then from the administration. So that has been a barrier. And understanding and developing trust in its purpose.
In my role as the Director of Assessment, I think that you get to meet with and work with faculty with all different levels of interest in assessment, sometimes levels of resistance to assessment, and levels of knowledge about and awareness of what assessment is and how we use it. And so one of the biggest challenges for me is being able to approach everybody where they're starting from in terms of interest in, resistance to, knowledge about assessment, and to hopefully help them all to see that, that there is a benefit and that there are going to be ways, it's going to be work, but there are going to be ways that this work is going to pay dividends that, for their teaching and learning, and is going to bring them together as a program and help them to move forward. So I think that we often call it building a culture of assessment on a campus where you sort of bring people together to to some level of shared understanding of how this is important and how it's valuable. But that's a very challenging thing when, as I said, you're dealing with people coming from a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different places.
Our biggest challenge was really just creating a culture of assessment, really trying to get everyone on board, because when we had our very first assessment retreat before our current dean was even hired, I think fewer people sort of understood what it was that we were trying to accomplish. And I just remember one person saying, after we had gone through this workshop and we had talked about rubrics and all of this stuff, one person saying, this is all great, but I don't have time for this. And I think that resonated with a lot of people. There's just, no one ever feels like they have enough time.
Some of the bumps along the way that we've encountered as far as building assessment as a consistent piece is that it's really hard. It's much easier to lecture, and it's much easier to sort of say, well, I know they know it because I said it, and to really push faculty to think about, well, how did you assess it for this student? Because a team of students participated in an activity, does it mean that each student achieved the competency? We don't know if we don't have the assessment from each individual student.
I think one of the biggest concerns that people have had, in addition to time and resources that I already talked about, is some concern over losing their sort of identity or their fingerprints, I guess, on the courses that they teach. I think that some of the faculty had a concern that by trying to standardize some aspects of the course in order to have a set of rubrics that might be applicable across different kinds of courses, or to have a standard assignment that we could use for course-embedded assessment. I think there was some fear that we were sort of taking their courses away or telling them how to teach their courses.
I think the question of shared commitment partially comes back to a question of governance also, right? So how is the faculty as a whole responsible for these 6 undergraduate essential capabilities? And who on the faculty is responsible? Is it one of those cases where since everybody is responsible, nobody is responsible?
I have done some research on physical therapy students and critical thinking using some standardized testing. I think there's 2 difficult aspects of that. I've had, not just myself, but we have to go through the Institutional Review Board, and we go through the Spalding Institutional Review Board. which is really a medical review board. And there's been a real issue with educational research, and they don't understand educational research. And it's been harder for us to get educational projects through the IRB than medical projects. And it's like beating your head sometimes against the wall. You know, you get these forms, and they ask you questions, and the questions really don't make any sense to what you're doing. And you know, you might answer one of those questions incorrectly because you're interpreting it wrong, and then it sits for 2 weeks. And anyway, that's been very frustrating. And the other aspect of that, in trying to collect data for research, is trying to get the students interested enough to participate. Because, of course, we can't make it a requirement unless it is a program requirement. And I can't say we've had the best participation, and it's been frustrating. It's been disappointing, you know, because you go in and you explain to the students why it's important, and that you know, that data essentially could affect change in the future, and you know, the participation is always less than what I hope it to. I would hope it to be.
There's a number of challenges. I think one is even just getting the data from the students. So for instance, you know, we've been doing an alumni survey for a number of years, and the response rate to that survey tends to hover around 35%, and that's not a really great response rate. And it's challenging to kind of figure out how to increase that. We had an exit survey this year for the first time, and the response rate for that survey was definitely higher. But you know, in order for surveys or even course evaluations, things like that, where the burden is really on the student to participate, it really can be a challenge just to get them to do that. In terms of other kinds of assessment, especially more direct assessment of learning, you know, if we have a course embedded assignment, for the most part, students are going to do that, so we have the data. Then the challenge is more about finding the time to really work with that. You know, it took, when we did our program learning assessment this past year, we had 4 faculty members who worked for about 4 hours, I think, to go through 50 assignments and score them against a rubric. So just kind of making sure that we've got the time and resources to do that can be a little bit of a challenge. And you know, we're still in the process of sort of ironing out some of the details. So for instance, we did discover as we were doing this that one of the rubrics that we were using really wasn't robust enough to do as much assessment of the particular assignment as we wanted. So we were still able to score the assignment, and we were still able to kind of get an overall view of how students were achieving that particular outcome. But then we had to go back to the faculty that designed that assignment and that rubric and really ask them to flesh it out a little bit more.
I think some of the common complaints are that maybe the assignment wasn't clear, and that's why that's why it's not in the evidence. The other common complaint is that someone might not necessarily agree with a particular standard. So the standard may say this, and someone philosophically might say, you know, I don't think that all graduates should have to achieve that. I think, and so that then comes to putting everyone on the same page as, okay, well, philosophically, what do we believe? And these are our learning outcomes, and you have to report to so many different people, both regional accreditors and specialty accreditors, and sometimes those match nicely, and sometimes they don't, and people sort of lose track of, wait a minute, am I supposed to ensure they achieve this, or can they just achieve this? And sometimes we achieve above where the bar says. Many times we do, and then that becomes confusing because they're targeting a different level.
One of the major impediments to using assessment data and making use of assessment data is faculty confidence in the data. It's very easy to look at the data and accuse it of, you know, having too small sample size, accusing the data of, you know, not being a representative sample of the students, you know, arguing that the data that you've collected is, and the tool that you've used to select it doesn't really have validity. All of those things, we can argue, and sometimes we're right. Sometimes that's, sometimes there really are severe issues around those, and I think that that struggle is never going to go away, because we're not, we can always get closer, as in any kind of experimental design. We can always get closer to, measuring what we think we're measuring, but we'll always be subject to some imperfections. And so I really think it's important that we figure out how to come to terms with living with the imperfect nature of our data, and recognizing that we're not trying to actually prove something about our student learning. We're actually trying to improve something about our student learning. This is, this is action research that's designed to give us a little bit more insight than we had when we sat around in a faculty meeting and said, my students can't write, and to delve a little deeper into that question. Well, what is it that they're struggling with in their writing? Let's look at their writing and think about it more carefully.
Some of the barriers are, what's the right number, right? So how many years, how many times do you do the assessment measure before you say it's not the right measure? So if you have 30 students go through the assessment measure one semester and 30 go through the next semester, what are the key changes you have to make in between those semesters for to really actualize? Where's the meaningful change? Is it just because this group of students didn't get it? Is it because the tool was wrong? Is it because the activity was wrong? And so that's, I think, part of the ongoing challenge is how do you evolve and change in a meaningful way? So you're not constantly changing and can use the data to really say, okay, now we have substantial data. We have 100 students who've done this activity and X number continue to struggle with X. So finding that increment of when to change and when to use the data to drive change.
The way my particular schedule goes, I teach so much. I teach probably 2/3 my entire load in one semester, and it makes anything difficult that semester. And I feel like it takes me half of the next semester just kind of to recover, just because I'm in the classroom some weeks 20 hours, and that's just a lot with students. So I think time is the biggest obstacle. It's finding that time to sit down and really think about, the data, think about what the data is telling you, and then reflecting and coming up with proposed changes.